Most people think social media is where personalities shine. But for empaths, it's often where they disappear. Not because they have nothing to say, not because they're antisocial, and definitely not because they lack confidence. The truth is far darker than that. Empaths understand something most people never notice. Every time you post online, you are leaking psychological data, your emotional state, your insecurities, your dopamine triggers, your loneliness, your need for validation, your identity. And empaths can feel the emotional hunger behind social media almost instantly. That's why many of them slowly back away from it, because what looks normal to everyone else feels emotionally radioactive to them. Neuroscience now shows that social media platforms trigger the same reward circuitry involved in addiction. Dopamine spikes fire through the brain every time someone receives a notification, a like, or social approval. But empaths experience emotional environments more intensely than average people. Studies on mirror neurons suggest highly sensitive individuals may absorb emotional signals with unusual depth. They don't just observe tension online, they feel it. The desperation behind selfies, the loneliness behind constant posting, the hidden competition, the fake happiness, the silent begging for significance. And after enough exposure, many empaths begin withdrawing without even realizing why. Because their nervous system starts treating social media like emotional noise pollution. Look closely at the modern internet. Everyone is performing. People don't post their lives anymore. They post edited identities. Entire personalities are built from carefully selected angles, fake confidence, exaggerated success, filtered beauty, and emotional manipulation. But empaths are unusually good at detecting emotional incongruence. Behavioral psychology shows that humans constantly leak microsignals when they're being inauthentic. Tone shifts for WSAD enthusiasm, emotional overcompensation, validation-seeking language. Most people miss these cues. Empaths don't. That's why scrolling social media can feel exhausting to them in ways they can't explain. Their brain keeps detecting emotional contradictions non-stop. Someone smiling while silently depressed. Someone preaching confidence while emotionally collapsing. Someone posting inspirational quotes while manipulating everyone around them. And eventually the empath realizes something terrifying. Social media rewards performance more than authenticity. The louder the personality, the more attention it gets. The more controversial the behavior, the more visibility it receives. The more emotionally provocative the content, the faster it spreads. Quiet authenticity gets buried. And many empaths would rather disappear than compete inside that system. But there's another reason empaths stay hidden online. Observation. Most empaths are watchers before they are speakers. While others rush to upload every emotion, empaths study people silently. There's a moment every empath experiences online that nobody else seems to notice. A strange feeling. You scroll past a smiling face, but something feels wrong. The words sound confident, but the energy underneath feels desperate. The laughter feels rehearsed. The happiness feels strained. The motivation feels hollow. And within seconds, the empath senses something most people completely miss. The person on the screen is performing. Science may finally explain why this happens. Researchers studying emotional intelligence and nonverbal perception discovered that certain people process emotional cues at a much deeper neurological level than others. Highly sensitive individuals often show increased activity in areas of the brain linked to empathy, emotional recognition, and social awareness. In simple terms, their brains are constantly scanning for emotional truth. That means an empath rarely hears only "whoa," but they hear tension inside the words. They notice the pause before someone says, "I'm fine." They notice forced smiles, overcompensating confidence, exaggerated positivity, artificial charm. And social media has become the perfect environment for emotional masking. Think about it. Human beings now spend hours every day broadcasting edited versions of themselves to strangers. Perfect angles, perfect lighting, perfect relationships, perfect lifestyles. But behind many of those images, the nervous system is collapsing. Studies have linked excessive social media use to rising levels of anxiety, depression, loneliness, sleep disorders, and emotional instability. One shocking report found that heavy social media users show significantly higher rates of psychological distress compared to people who spend less time online. Yet the strangest part is this. The more emotionally broken people become, the more perfect their online identity often looks. And empaths feel this contradiction. We CD on instantly, because the empath mind is built differently. Neuroscientists studying mirror neurons discovered that some people unconsciously simulate the emotions of others inside their own brain. It's one reason humans feel emotional contagion. You walk into a tense room, and suddenly you feel tense. You sit beside someone grieving, and your chest becomes heavy. But for empaths, this effect can become overwhelming. Social media creates thousands of emotional exposures every single day. One post carries insecurity. Another carries jealousy. Another carries narcissism. Another carries loneliness hidden beneath attention-seeking behavior. And while most users consume content passively, the empath absorbs it emotionally. That's why many empaths become exhausted after scrolling for only a short time. Their nervous system is processing emotional static non-stop, and here's where it becomes dangerous. Most people online aren't showing reality anymore. They're showing psychological survival strategies. Some people post constantly because they fear invisibility. Some seek validation because their self-worth is collapsing internally. Some use humor to hide depression. Some use motivational content to convince themselves they're not broken. Some flex wealth because they feel emotionally powerless. Behavioral psychologists call this compensatory behavior. Humans often exaggerate externally what they lack internally, and empaths unconsciously detect it. This is why empaths often become uncomfortable around influencers, fake positivity, or performative personalities long before anyone else notices the cracks. Because they can feel emotional incongruence. The human brain leaks truth constantly, even through screens. Micro-expressions flash across faces for milliseconds. Forced smiles activate different facial muscles than genuine smiles. Tone patterns subtly shift when someone lies. Over-explaining often signals insecurity. Excessive posting can reflect. We CT emotional dependency on attention. Most people never consciously notice these cues. But empaths often do without understanding how. Their brain pieces together emotional inconsistencies automatically, and over time, social media becomes emotionally disturbing for them. Not entertaining. Disturbing. Because eventually the empath realizes something terrifying. Many people online are not trying to connect. They're trying to be seen. And there's a difference. Connection is honest. Performance is calculated. Connection feels peaceful. Performance feels hungry. The empath senses that hunger immediately. The hunger for approval, for attention, for reassurance, for validation, for identity. And the more emotionally intelligent the empath becomes, the harder it becomes to ignore. This is also why empaths often disappear from social media without explanation. People assume they became antisocial. But the truth is more psychological than that. Their nervous system reached overload. Research on chronic emotional stimulation shows that constant exposure to emotionally charged information increases cortisol levels inside the body. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone. Too much cortisol over time has been linked to weakened immunity, poor sleep, anxiety disorders, digestive problems, brain fog, and even cardiovascular stress. Now imagine what happens when someone emotionally absorbs every environment deeply. The empath scrolls through conflict, tragedy, envy, fake happiness, political rage, silent loneliness, emotional manipulation, hour after hour, day after day. Eventually the brain begins treating social media like danger, and the body responds accordingly. Fatigue, mental exhaustion, emotional numbness, withdrawal. This is why some empaths become unusually private with age. Not because they stopped caring, because they finally understood something society never teaches. Protecting your nervous system is survival. And perhaps the darkest truth of all is this. Social media rewards people who can perform emotions better than they can process emotions. The loudest people get attention. The most provocative people get visibility. The most emotionally reactive people dominate algorithms. Meanwhile, genuine people often disappear into silence, not because they lack value, Because authenticity is quieter. Real peace rarely advertises itself. Real confidence doesn't beg to be witnessed. Real emotional stability doesn't need constant proof. And deep down, empaths know this instinctively. That's why many of them stop chasing visibility. They stop explaining themselves online. Stop documenting every emotion. Stop competing for attention. Because they begin realizing attention is not the same as connection. In fact, some of the loneliest people on earth are surrounded by digital attention every single day. Thousands of followers, hundreds of comments, constant interaction. Yet internally, they feel invisible. Empath. We HS sense this hidden loneliness everywhere online. The smiling photos that feel empty. The motivational speeches hiding exhaustion. The perfect couples silently collapsing behind cameras. And after enough exposure, the empath changes. They become quieter, more observant, more selective, not weak, aware. Aware that energy transfers through attention. Aware that emotional environments shape mental health. Aware that constantly exposing yourself to performative behavior slowly disconnects people from reality itself. So while the world becomes louder, the empath often becomes silent. And ironically, that silence protects them. Because once you begin seeing emotional truth behind people's masks, social media no longer feels entertaining. It feels like walking through millions of invisible nervous systems screaming for validation at the exact same time. And the empath hears all of it. Most people think exhaustion comes from physical work, but for empaths, exhaustion often comes. Wheeze from invisible emotional exposure, and nowhere is that exposure more relentless than social media. Every scroll, every video, every comment section, every argument, every tragedy, every fake smile. The empath nervous system absorbs it all, even when they don't want to. Science now confirms something ancient cultures seemed to understand long ago. The human nervous system is deeply affected by emotional environments. Researchers studying emotional contagion discovered that emotions spread between people almost like viruses. Anxiety transfers, anger transfers, fear transfers, stress transfers. One emotionally charged interaction can alter heart rate, cortisol levels, and nervous system activity within minutes. Now imagine exposing your brain to thousands of emotional signals every single day. That's modern social media. And empaths are especially vulnerable to its effects. Because empaths don't just observe emotion. They internally simulate it. Neuroscientists studying mirror neurons found that certain people unconsciously mirror the emotional states they witness around them. Their brains recreate what others feel as if experiencing it firsthand. That means an empath scrolling online may not simply watch suffering, they partially experience it neurologically. The brain often cannot fully distinguish between directly experienced emotional stress and emotionally absorbed stress. This is why many empaths feel mentally drained after only a few minutes online, while others can scroll endlessly without noticing anything. The empath nervous system is processing emotional intensity nonstop, and social media was never designed for sensitive nervous systems. It was designed for stimulation. Algorithms reward outrage, shock, conflict, fear, comparison, addiction. The content that spreads fastest is usually the content that triggers the strongest emotional reaction. Because emotional activation keeps people scrolling, and the human brain pays a price for that. Researchers have linked chronic exposure to emotionally stimulating media with increased anxiety symptoms, sleep disruption, attention problems, and rising stress hormone levels. One shocking study found that doom-scrolling negative content can significantly increase feelings of helplessness and psychological distress. But for empaths, the effect often goes deeper. Because they absorb emotional atmosphere almost like psychological sponges. A normal person may watch an angry debate and move on. The empath carries the emotional residue for hours, sometimes days. Their body remembers tension long after the screen turns off. This is why many empaths suddenly feel exhausted without understanding why. Their nervous system never fully relaxes, and the body begins sending warning signals. Headaches, brain fog, fatigue, irritability, insomnia, emotional numbness, difficulty concentrating. These are not imaginary symptoms. They are biological stress responses. When the nervous, Wu's system stays overstimulated too long, cortisol and adrenaline remain elevated inside the body. And prolonged cortisol exposure is dangerous. It weakens immune function, disrupts digestion, accelerates aging, impairs memory, increases inflammation, raises risk for anxiety and depression. The terrifying part is that many people experience these symptoms daily without realizing social media is intensifying them, especially empaths. Because empaths are highly sensitive to emotional inconsistency, and social media is full of it. A person crying for attention while pretending to be confident. Someone preaching self-love while secretly hating themselves. Someone showing luxury while drowning in debt. Someone smiling online while emotionally collapsing offline. The empath nervous system detects these contradictions automatically. Every inconsistency creates psychological tension, and over time, that tension becomes exhausting. Behavioral scientists call this cognitive emotional overload. The brain becomes overwhelmed trying to process conflicting emotional information continuously. That's why empaths often feel strangely unsafe online even when nothing bad is happening directly to them. Their nervous system stays alert, scanning, analyzing, absorbing, and eventually the empath begins changing. They stop replying as much, stop posting, stop engaging, stop explaining themselves, not because they lost interest in people, because their nervous system is trying to survive. There's also another hidden danger social media creates for empaths: comparison trauma. Humans naturally compare themselves socially. Psychologists believe this behavior evolved to help humans measure survival status inside groups. But social media weaponized comparison at a scale the human brain was never built to handle. In a single hour, someone can compare their body, income, success, beauty, relationships, and lifestyle against hundreds of carefully edited lives. And the brain treats those comparisons as real social measurements. Studies have linked excessive social comparison to depression, insecurity, low self-esteem, and emotional instability. But empaths experience another layer of damage, because they don't only compare themselves. They emotionally absorb the insecurity of everyone else competing too. The desperation, the envy, the silent self-hatred. Empaths feel the emotional suffering hiding beneath performance culture. And after enough exposure, many begin withdrawing from the digital world completely. People misunderstand this withdrawal. They think the empath became distant, cold, emotionless. But often the opposite is happening. The empath is overstimulated beyond capacity. Imagine standing in a room where thousands of people are shouting emotionally at the exact same time. Some are screaming for validation. Some are screaming from loneliness. Some are screaming from insecurity. Some are screaming from narcissism. Some are screaming from pain. That's what social media feels like to many empaths, an invisible emotional storm. And eventually the body forces them to retreat, because the nervous system has limits. This is why some empaths become fiercely protective of silence. Silence becomes medicine. Privacy becomes recovery. Isolation becomes nervous system repair. Modern neuroscience now confirms that quiet environments help regulate overstimulated brains. Time away from constant stimulation allows stress hormones to decrease while the nervous system gradually returns to balance. But most people never disconnect long enough to recover. They wake up checking notifications, sleep beside glowing screens, consume emotional stimulation every waking hour, and their brain never fully exits survival mode. Empaths feel this damage earlier than others because their sensitivity exposes the problem faster. What society calls being too sensitive is often an early warning system. The empath notices emotion, toxicity before others do, and that awareness eventually changes how they live. They stop craving visibility, stop chasing online approval, stop feeding the algorithm with their private emotions, because they realize something deeply unsettling. The internet profits from emotional dysregulation. The more anxious people become, the longer they scroll. The more insecure people become, the more they consume. The more emotionally reactive people become, the more profitable they are. And empaths slowly begin rejecting that system. Not loudly, quietly. They disappear from chaos, reduce exposure, protect their attention, guard their peace. And while the world interprets their silence as weakness, it's often the first sign they are finally healing. Because the empath eventually understands a truth modern society ignores completely. Not every environment deserves access to your nervous system. And social media may be one of the most psychologically expensive environments Edie has ever created. At first, the empath shares everything: their thoughts, their feelings, their dreams, their pain. They believe openness creates connection. So they post honestly, love openly, trust quickly, reveal vulnerabilities without hesitation. And for a while it feels beautiful. People respond. Support pours in. Attention feels comforting. But slowly, the empath begins noticing something disturbing. The more access people have to your inner world, the more power they gain over your emotions. And social media has turned emotional access into a global addiction. Every photo reveals psychological information. Every caption exposes emotional patterns. Every reaction teaches people what affects you. Every vulnerable moment becomes data. Most people never think about this. Empaths eventually do. Because empaths study human behavior whether they realize it or not. They notice who only appears when you're succeeding, who disappears when you're struggling, who secretly, why competes with you, who watches silently without supporting you, who gathers information not from love, but from curiosity, envy, or control. And once the empath sees these patterns enough times, they change forever. Psychologists call this boundary awakening. The moment someone realizes access to them should be earned, not freely available. But social media encourages the opposite. Overshare everything. Document everything. Expose every emotion in real time. Modern culture treats privacy almost like weakness. If you disappear, people assume something is wrong. If you stop posting, they think you're unhappy. If you become private, they become suspicious. But the empath slowly learns something dangerous about human nature. Not everyone who watches you supports you. Some people study you to compare themselves. Some watch hoping you fail. Some collect your weaknesses unconsciously. Some monitor your emotional state to understand how to manipulate you later. Behavioral experts know that humans constantly reveal psychological leverage points without realizing it. Your insecurities, your loneliness, your attachment patterns, your validation needs, your emotional triggers. And social media exposes all of them publicly. The empath eventually recognizes this emotional vulnerability instinctively. That's when silence begins, not fearful silence, intentional silence, because the empath finally understands that privacy is not hiding, privacy is protection. Science supports this more than people realize. Studies show that constant self-disclosure online can increase anxiety, emotional dependency, and identity instability. The brain begins linking self-worth to external reactions. Likes become emotional validation. Views become self-esteem measurements. Attention becomes psychological survival. And when validation disappears, many people emotionally collapse. The empath notices this addiction everywhere. People posting not because they're happy, but because they need reassurance. People sharing relationships to prove they're loved, sharing success to prove they matter, sharing pain to feel seen. And beneath all of it, the empath senses fear, the fear of invisibility. But empaths eventually discover something society rarely teaches. The most powerful people often move quietly. Real confidence doesn't announce itself constantly. Real peace rarely needs witnesses. Real happiness is usually happening away from cameras. And the empath begins protecting those private parts of life like treasure, because they learned through experience that visibility attracts energy. Not all energy is healthy. Some attention heals. Some attention drains. This becomes painfully clear after betrayal. Many empaths are deeply trusting early in life. They believe emotional honesty creates emotional safety, until someone uses their vulnerability against them. A private insecurity repeated publicly. A weakness used during conflict, a dream mock, trauma weaponized. The empath never forgets these moments, because emotional betrayal cuts deeper for sensitive nervous systems. Neuroscience shows that emotional pain activates many of the same brain regions involved in physical pain. Rejection, humiliation, and betrayal are not just emotions. The brain experiences them as genuine threats. And after enough emotional wounds, the empath adapts, not by becoming cruel, by becoming selective. Selective with access, selective with energy, selective with exposure. Suddenly they stop explaining every decision online. They stop proving themselves, stop seeking approval, stop narrating their lives for strangers. And something fascinating begins happening psychologically. Their inner world becomes stronger, because energy that once went into performance now goes inward, into healing, into observation, into self-control, into peace. Behavioral psychology has long understood a powerful truth. Mystery creates psychological gravity. Human beings become obsessed with what they cannot fully access. The less emotionally available someone becomes publicly, the more attention they often attract unintentionally. Because scarcity creates value inside the human mind, the empath notices this irony quickly. The moment they stop chasing attention, people become more curious about them. But by then, the empath no longer craves visibility the same way. They've seen behind the curtain. They understand how much of social media is emotional theater, people performing confidence while silently insecure, performing success while emotionally empty, performing happiness while mentally exhausted. And the empath grows tired of performance entirely. This is why many empaths become almost invisible online with age. Not because they disappeared from life, because they return to real life, real conversations, real friendships, real peace, real nervous system safety. They begin valuing